Rachel.
Hey, Andy.
I love that we're doing this, kind of coming together to talk about how we connect cultures and some of the important aspects and elements people should be thinking about. I'll introduce myself. I'm Andy Herbert. I am a kind work culture creator. I believe strongly in when we have kind cultures, we build engaged, productive workforces, and we see more productivity, we see happier employees, we see better financial performance. In addition to that, I'm a big believer in cognitive diversity. So I think having the most ideas and thoughts and differences in thoughts in the room are how we get to our best place and to be our most successful. And one interesting fact about me is I'm a baker. And I think I bake to remind myself that failure is only temporary. So we just look at progress over perfection.
I love it. I don't think I knew that you were a baker. Oh, that's awesome. Hey, Andy. No, hey, everybody. I'm Rachel Gass. I'm a leadership coach. My passion is really around cultivating leaders at all levels. So regardless of where you sit, wherever you are in the hierarchy or your title, but to empower people to be the change they want to see. Thank you, Gandhi. And do that with confidence and authenticity. And of course, kindness. So my 3 core values are people first, kindness counts, and integrity always. And the kindness is where you and I have the meeting of the minds. Well, so many things. But when we first connected on LinkedIn, it was like, kind. Oh, yay, my soulmate.
Yeah, exactly.
And we did meet on LinkedIn, a totally random connection.
Completely random connection.
Yeah. And so you and I feel like are really embodying the power of connection, and how important it is.
I think having the courage to step out of your comfort zone and sometimes force a thing that maybe didn't happen naturally. You and I did not work together at some company. I don't even think we existed in a similar group or anything. I'm not even sure how our universes came into a line, but I think you were stepping out and just being like, hey, this is a thing. We have a thing, and let's connect and see if that thing can be a thing. And it's been an absolute pleasure since.
Same. And we just love our conversations. We've had such energizing conversations and oh wow, we're in sync, that we thought we'd share our musings with the world. So we just hit the record button and here we are talking about the importance of connections, right? The importance of how we connect with each other, people, putting people first, and how that engagement impacts how we show up, how we do the work, how we're connected to the goals, how we're connected to our leadership, up and down, and our leadership style, but also how we're connected to the success of where we work. So we've got lots to talk about around connections, connecting people, and how that shows up as psychological safety, and the importance of when people show up and how they feel safe. And then also connecting to the process, right? How are we connecting to the work, cascading goals, knowing what we're doing, that we all feel aligned to the work that's happening. And of course, connected to the profits. And the best way to be connected to the profits and the bottom line is to empower folks, and how we do that through enabling, which what I love that you say is a problem solving workforce. So we're going to talk about a little of that. So connected cultures on people, process, and profits. And today, part 1 of 3, we're going to talk about psychological safety and connecting with people.
One of my favorites. Let's get into it.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about psychological safety.
Yeah. And I think you just hit on so many things, because all you're hearing about is great resignation and these mass walkouts, and, you know, people essentially not having a lot of confidence and faith in, you know, traditional workplaces. So I love, obviously, you and I love this topic. And in particular, I think just the groundwork of psychological safety, you know, really having a psychologically safe workforce is really the foundation of how you really can't build anything without that as sort of the fundamental piece of it. So I'm excited to talk about this today. And you mentioned how we met on LinkedIn, and I just want to just, like, the power of confidence to just step out and make an introduction to someone that you don't know is, I think this is such a great lesson in how powerful that is, that sometimes just be a little bit vulnerable and you never know what can come from that. So I love this.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure the pandemic and being remote and wanting to make connections too played a part in that, right? Filling a little bit of a void for ourselves, and what an awesome connection it's been. So most grateful. Yeah. And
I love
think
it.
too, like, we talk about psychological safety, and we see so much out there, and the great Amy Edmondson and all the work that she does to bring awareness to the topic. But like you said, so much of it is having confidence, you know, to be able to be the change you want to see, to have the vocabulary to start the conversation, and just to find that courage, because it's hard. And especially when we work for those of us who have worked or are currently working in large organizations, it becomes even harder to find that voice and not feel that you're not being a team player when you're asking questions, or, you know, sharing an alternative point of view that might seem like, oh, we're being contrary, you know.
Right.
And so it's even more important than as leaders and those who are we'll just say at the top too, that are really defining the culture, to make sure that they're role modeling and embodying what it actually means to create that safety for people to show up.
Right. It's sort of like when you're in class and you really, like, the teacher said something, you really want to comment, but you're so afraid to comment, and you're like waiting, is anybody else going to comment something similar to me? Right. It's sort of that type of feeling. And I think what you see is we stifle massive creativity, right, when the environment's not safe, because then the person who didn't raise their hand, who doesn't feel confident to make the comment, make the suggestion, could be missing out on just such amazing, you know, an amazing opportunity to do something different that other people hadn't thought of.
Yeah, totally. And like, that's why I loved at the early stages of projects where all it was brainstorming. Right, like bring the ideas, bring it all, different solutions. Like, what's the story that is told about shaking the tree and the helicopter coming over, and all of these things just like beget new ideas, you know. So when whatever it is that you say just generates another idea from somebody else, right? So, and I think that becomes more of the learner mindset, you know, not that's the growth mindset of, even if I say something that might be a little out in left field, it's spurring another thought from somebody else that might get us to the end goal. So
yeah, I was just gonna say, I had the luck to work at Stanford Healthcare for a little while, and so we got to participate in Stanford's D School. They did some programs, and part of the program, when you're first session, where you're like, okay, here's this problem. It was the yes and. So there wasn't a no, or oh, that can't be done, or here's the regulation. It was like, we don't care about it. We're just going with yes and. So it's this, and it's amazing how free minds become when they're not encumbered by rules, policies, regulations.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we can go back to no if we need to get to know, but let's just start with all the yeses and just see what's out there and what's available.
Yeah, and I like that you're bringing up the point about regulations and stuff, because I worked in a heavily regulated, whether it was healthcare or finance, and every industry has their regulations. So we get real quick with the knee jerk to be like, no, and this is all the reasons why it can't. And so that becomes like a much harder thing to swim upstream against, because that's where we're comfortable going. All right.
Totally agree. I think part of it too is we end up getting in this space in organizations. We get in this space because there's this level of competition that's created, which sort of leads us, I think, into the scarcity discussion, right? And around what's available for you might not be available for me. And so now I start to build my little kingdom, and I start to close my stuff off, and I start to not share my information, and sort of, I think businesses have been built on this competition, this idea of competition, right?
And I think humans are built on that idea, right? That is in our that's in our DNA, right? We have this scarcity mindset. It's hunter-gatherers. We're hardwired for this, right? To say, if I got to go get the food, right, before somebody else does, I got to get out there and do my thing. And if I don't do it right now, then it's not going to be there. So that just breeding that kind of competition and getting to the end goal, like we're hardwired for that, and not saying like, actually, I could maybe take a minute, take a breath, take a beat to figure out actually what is the best thing, instead of just accomplishing something, and I've totally fallen into that, right? Moving the needle, just getting something done.
And it's technology though, right? Because as a society, like when you're living in a village, for example, that doesn't happen. It only happens when you're trying to compete against the other village. What we've done is we've now brought it into our own village, where it's like we're now fighting each other for the same, like we all have to eat.
Yeah, good point. Let's get the best food. Yeah. No, good point. And I was that's an awesome point. I even found, I like that they're teaching this in school now. So I pulled up, my daughter had this on her billboard, and it's Stephen Covey's Leader in Me, and it's think win-win, right? So they're teaching this now with younger kids to have that mindset of, how do we both win, right? It's not a sum zero game. We can both win. It's not pie. It's like talking about love. Well, if I have a baby, then I don't have enough love for my spouse. Well, that's not the case, right? Love just grows. We don't chunk it out. You have another kid, that they don't take away the love, although older siblings fear that, right? So.
Right. And I'm going to pull up, if you'll give me a little liberty here, a statistic that I saw through SHRM, if I can get my life in order. A statistic that I saw through SHRM, which I thought was really interesting, about this sort of, it sort of goes to this kind of scarcity discussion.
Yeah.
And it really speaks, when we start to think scarcity, we start to close our circles, we start to create silos, and inevitably what we get from that is lower productivity. We get, terrible communication. We, all the things.
Collaboration totally suffers, and problem solving, right? You're only problem solving your viewpoint.
Oh, and how many times do you see someone problem solved from their silo and like destroyed, up and downstream, and kind of productivity up or downstream? Yeah. So this statistic came again from a SHRM article, and it talks about poor communication and what that costs companies. So it has a cost structure around companies with around 100,000 employees or more. It costs roughly $62 million a year. Poor communication.
Wow.
$62 a year.
Wow. And what's coming up for me when you say poor communication, because I was just coaching some folks around this on influence, right? How are you communicating what's important to them? Back to the bit about process, you make a change over here and it screws everything else up downstream, or you don't share with them clearly what's in it for them to like care about why we need to change this process. And so it just goes, whatever. they, you know, ignore it, and you make your little change there, and the repercussions of that, not only is it just didn't really fix the problem, but other things broke, and we missed a huge opportunity to be able to collaborate and make things better for ourselves and ultimately our client.
Right. So a lot of times I fix it, and we go, if we full circle on the scarcity discussion, right? I have fixed it, and I'm going to go promote that I've done this great thing, and you're going to give me high fives and
Competition.
expand my budget, expand my team, and do all of that, not knowing that you just literally destroyed. So it inevitably,
And that's what gets rewarded, right? That's the bummer too. Like you said,
yeah.
Now I've got the bigger team, more resources, because we are competing internally with each other for
not realizing that at the end of the day, what we all should be competing for, and I know we're going to talk about this in, you know, one of our next sessions, is really competing for how are we all going to accomplish these goals, right? Everything that we're doing should be so intrinsically linked that it's, that we're all trying to move, that if I fix something that destroys your thing, it now also hurts me. It doesn't actually help
not
me.
a win for
that
me
sort
either.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's the transition.
It is not win-win. It is not
win-win. It's not win-win. Yeah.
But, you know, back to our DNA, what we're kind of built for. So I do feel like we're swimming upstream, and we hear these things like, he with the most toys wins, you know, like, okay,
right.
You know, and that comes from really a place of fear, right? I've got a far way to fall. It keeps my job safe. I've got all these other voices in my head, my saboteur, my imposter, you know, if I afraid to share the ideas, you know, and all of that, just, it really does come from a place of fear. So
right.
I am always reminded of I worked for Kaiser Permanente, and Bernard Tyson was the CEO. He passed away a few years ago. Much beloved, just I mean, talk about somebody who could inspire a shared vision. But I remember him saying that, like, I was fortunate enough to hear him at a DE&I conference one year, and just being very clear, like, it is everyone's job. It is in your job description to share your point of view, to share your thoughts, to bring your perspective that we hired you as the person, you know, bringing your perspective into the conversation. So we do talk a lot about psychological safety and having that culture and the responsibility of leaders to create it. But there is also a responsibility on all of us as employees to have some psychological bravery. I don't know if that's a term, but maybe I read it somewhere. You know, just to say, like, yeah, I'm gonna have to be brave. I'm gonna have to be bold and find that voice inside of me and put my imposter or my fear of maybe not winning all the time aside, to be able to bring the best ideas and continue generating the conversation, you know, continuing to move that thought.
I mean, without question, and that's part of what organizations have to create, though, is that space, right? Where I love the psychological bravery, and I would add with that psychological vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
You have to be okay with sharing and what that feedback might become. We want to create this environment where everyone is open and you can share, but also everyone might not like your ideas, and that's okay too.
And that is okay,
right?
Too. Yeah. And that's, again, that comes from the place of fear or imposter of, like, is that really okay? Right. And I was thinking about this quote. It might even be Abe Lincoln. I don't know who it is. I should have looked it up. But like, something to the gist of keep quiet and let them think you're smart or think you're stupid versus opening your mouth and proving them wrong, or something like that, which is like, basically, if you just keep quiet, then nobody will think you're stupid. And I mean, I heard that at a very young age, and that plagues me in the back of my mind. Like, yeah, so if that's what we're taught, to not speak up because of this fear that we might be perceived as dumb, Well,
Right.
that's not really gonna, that's really not gonna generate new ideas or bring different perspectives into the conversation. Then you just have, like you said before, everybody who agrees. Now we're just piling on to the agreement and not hearing other ideas.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you and I have had this conversation kind of about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, you know, the space that we're in today, it's critically important, right? But where we could end up with some challenges is, you know, obviously we're focused today on some demographic groups that have been underrepresented, underserved, disenfranchised for years and years and years. I mean, we're in centuries at this point, right? So we have to do that work. It's critical, critical, critical.
Mm-hmm.
But where I get nervous is as we start to think diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really think about that from a demographic standpoint, are we actually including the idea of, you know, diversity of thought, to your point, right? And as we're talking about all of this. And so for me, I probably lean more towards the ideas of empathy and really keeping my elevator at curious, right? Going into conversations with folks where I might vehemently disagree with their perspective and their point of view, but taking a step back, trying to understand where they're coming from. And when we can do that, I feel, in my experience, I feel like when we can take a step back and kind of actually listen to one another, right? And what we're saying, and when an organization has created a space that's safe for us to have these kinds of discussions and dialogue back and forth, it's very interesting, you know, what comes out of those types of discussions. It's very interesting the innovation that happens, because now we're not spending time trying to prove or argue so that someone will think like we're thinking, and we're more just like, oh, I get where you're saying, and I get this, and then all of a sudden it starts to the point you made earlier, when you have these, you know, sort of brainstorming sessions, like stuff just starts to flow out because we don't sit in a defensive position anymore. I'm not trying to convince you of a thing. We're just sort of having this dialogue to try and get to this, you know, kind of agreeable end state.
Yeah, my idea is not better. I have to win. My idea has to bubble to the top. Yeah, no, I love that. And I love where, you know, when you talk about diversity of thought, and I do try and put my energy around inclusion and belonging. And I love how we've expanded, you know, D&I to DE&I, now DEI and B, and just thinking about how everybody's, and this comes back to empathy and compassion, understanding, like we've all had a different life experience and we're all coming at it in a different way, right? And so my life experiences are going to feed and frame the ideas that I have and the problems that I see, and there has to be space to discuss all of that. It's when we decide something is not okay to talk about, that's when we start to have issues. All right, we can't talk about that.
People don't stop talking about it. They just now talk about it in their silos. Like, I'm just gonna get with my
with
friends.
people who agree with them.
Yeah, like we're all just like little bobbleheads. Like, yeah. And for me, we just don't get to where we want to be, right? We're just all in our collective corners. Waiting to go have a boxing match again.
Yeah, figure out how we're gonna win.
And you know, it's so funny. A few years ago, I had a conversation with a friend of mine about the concept of right and wrong. It's probably a little controversial, but you know, as you think about big things like you know, like war and going to war, and each side is sort of, you know, maybe minus the one we're in now or the one that's happening now, but in many of them, you know, you have this side that says they believe they're right and this side believes they're right, and it's like, I can't really tell you who is or isn't right, but look at all the carnage that's happening because we've decided that there has to be a right and a wrong, and more times than not, just sit in the gray area, right? This is sort of a tangent, but there's a great YouTube channel called Soft White Underbelly, and it really looks at kind of the well, the most vulnerable of our population that we sort of want to hide away into a corner because maybe they're prostitutes, maybe they do drugs, maybe they, home insert here, whatever that thing is. Yeah. And when you listen to these stories and you hear these people talk about what their childhoods were, like the guy who's selling drugs today, what his childhood was, you gain perspective to say, I know selling drugs is not a good thing. That we can agree because it hurts. Well, that's probably not up for discussion. But is he a bad guy?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Or is he a victim? Yeah. And can you have compassion and empathy for how he got to that space?
It's that point. Yeah. So like, whereas I think you're doing something wrong, I don't like what you're doing. Can I still have empathy and compassion for you as a human? Especially, let me say this differently. I need to have empathy and compassion, and I need to at least hear your story. Yeah. Right. I need to not put my assumptions of who you are on you, but actually actively listen to your story. And even when I draw a conclusion that I don't love, still have empathy for you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's hard for people to do, right? Because we, like you said, everybody's got their ideologies, right? And this is what we hang on to. They're near and dear to us. And it is scary to actually recognize like, oh, I'm making a really big assumption here, and to be able to call that out for yourself and go, oh, I'm assuming a lot here. And how do I get more curious? How do I learn more about you and your experience with, and I think for some folks, there's a self-protection around that too.
Right.
Right. Like, I can't have all this in my mind. I can't, yes, war is bad and the carnage. And I feel like I could make a parallel to what we do in the corporate workforce too. Right. At what cost? I think 62 million is a good one a year of not communicating. Right. At what cost, and for how people experience the corporate setting and their colleagues and their leaders and, all those that work with them. How are we experiencing each other in a way that's meaningful, but when we're not, when we're not relating to each other, connecting with each other, how much are we missing out? How much are we really missing out just on the human experience? Running through life every day, doing the same thing. So how do we build that growth mindset into our work culture that enables us to connect with folks and really, and I hate to use the word, but like lean in to like what your experience is, who you are as a human. Like how do we connect with each other? Because when we can do that and really raise our own awareness about what's going on for other people and show that empathy, then we will be vulnerable, right? There is that vulnerability and bravery and confidence and all these things that continues to cultivate having a safe environment. But the first step is having that mindset where I can learn something from someone else. I don't have all the answers. There's always opportunity. There's always opportunity to learn.
Yeah. So. We're pausing.
Everything.
So we just covered all of that. So what he's saying is like we didn't really break them into segments. I think it's okay because I think it was a good conversation. Yeah.
I think our most important thing was that we hit the highlights, right? And maybe there's a couple things like the blame game and
so I think we just do. I think
maybe just some tangible takeaways.
That's what I think we just transition into now.
Okay. Yeah.
So we sort of, I think the last part you talked about was really obviously it's scarcity mindset, but really
Asking
just
questions,
around,
maybe we can just ask, you know.
yeah. So just think about this. That ending part that she had was a really good kind of, I think, summarization of all of it. And so my add to that would be really, you know, when we think about scarcity, when we think about, you know, DEI, and I love the B on that as well. It's not used enough yet, and and the belonging part is, I think, the critical piece of all of that. For me,
That's what's going to retain folks.
Say that again.
That's what's going to retain folks.
That's it, right? I mean, we've known that for years out of employee engagement surveys. Do you feel like you have friends at work?
Are you
know,
connected to?
Right? Yeah. But I think the foundation for all of that still kind of sits in this bucket of empathy, right? And, you know, really thinking we want to make sure we don't leave anybody behind in this, right? You know, as we think about how do we expand the idea of inclusion and belonging, of eliminating scarcity, and really creating a psychologically safe environment. So, you know, for me, I think there really kind of is some key things organizations can really do today. I mean, the number one thing would be reach out to you or I, right? We can definitely
obviously.
But I think there are some really key things that organizations can start and try almost immediately. I think what I would say before we sort of go into what those things are, I think it's critical for organizations to remember that this stuff isn't hard. It's just we have to be patient with the time on it, right? So you're not going to get to a solution and this outcome in a quarter.
Yeah,
right?
This isn't a drop-in program.
It's not.
It's a mindset shift.
It's difficult, but we have to have the patience and the time to invest. And with that, you'll end up seeing, I mean, we talked about it, $62 million in poor communication. So if you can waste $62 million a year, you can certainly.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you know, you said you touched on time, right? It's like, but that is what it takes. You have to slow down. The only way you connect with, and oh no, we don't have enough time. We got to meet this deliverable, blah, blah, blah. But you really have the time not to, because look how much more time it takes to clean up afterwards, or all the miscommunication, or all the money, all the things, right? But you do, I think the biggest thing is to slow down and connect with folks, right? I don't have time to ask questions. I just need this thing done. You know, or I feel rushed by my boss, so I don't want to waste their time. You know, well, we got to slow down. We got to create the time to say, let me understand a little bit more about where you're coming from. Something I tell folks that I coach and I'm working with specifically on this is ask 2 questions before you get into something. All right, like, either whether it's in a meeting that you're not a fly on the wall, you're invited to the meeting, so you're there. Edit that bit. So, you know, whether it's in a meeting that you're not active, you know, usually terribly active in, and that imposter is talking to you, your sabotaging voice is talking to you, but make it a point to ask 1 or 2 questions, you know, whatever that looks like for you. Slow it down, ask questions.
And you're investing the time either way. So if people don't
front
get
end
their
or back
questions
end,
answered, you get it on the front end or the back end. So for me, and when you're getting it on the back end, you've now wasted all of this other time that could have been focused on something else. So you're spending the time and the resources and all of it, no matter what. You don't get to get out of it, right?
And there's that intangible too on the back end of like a little bit of the carnage, you know, that you've done for folks, right? Their ego that wasn't tended to, you know, that they didn't feel listened to, that they didn't feel like they had the opportunity to be heard. And now on the back end, it's like, oh, well, that's now a problem, but throughout this whole time, they've been feeling really crappy and disengaged and definitely not connected to each other. So yeah, I mean, asking questions, even just having those like back pocket questions, they have to feel genuine for sure. You don't just ask a question for question's sake, or like a leading question, like, well, tell me what you're going to do about that 5.2, like that's not the same, that's not the same mindset that we're talking about. Like, really, what do you have to learn? How can you think about things differently?
Right.
And
thinking about this differently probably gets us right into really the best ways to begin the rehab on your culture, right? Build that growth mindset.
Yeah. And the blame game, right? That shows up. Whose fault was it? When we do lessons learned, which we all do, we spend a lot of time we spend like 2 seconds on what went right. We need to spend way more time on what went right. That's appreciative inquiry, but what all went wrong, and who can we, in the end of our minds, we're like, oh, and whose fault was that? Right? What department did that? Who said yes to that decision? Right? So really focusing on what are we going to do differently? What's working that we can enhance, and how do we all improve from this, and not blame each other. But
and I love for this
change that competition.
And for this one, I love when leaders show up and set the stage. So maybe instead of what went wrong or who did this or what happened here, we had an outcome that we didn't like. This is not how we want things to go. What can I have done differently, me personally, as your leader, to ensure we don't have this outcome again, right? So it shifts everything, and then everyone starts to think about what they could have done differently. So I love when leaders show up in that space. The blame game never works.
No, everybody's then disengaged, right? And fearful. We're just feeding into that fear and competition. But yeah, how do we celebrate more of that diversity of thought? How are we making sure everybody's voice is in the meeting, in the decision, and that is hard because everybody processes differently. We talk about introverts and extroverts are more apt to bring something up in the middle of the meeting. So how are you as a leader getting everybody's input without like calling somebody on the spot? Tell me exactly what you think right now. That's not celebrating the diversity of thought, but even just framing it in that way, right? The reason we do a pretty good job right now, maybe not everywhere, of building diverse teams, right? Trying not to have everybody who looks the same and does the same, and bringing in that, and then we let the same like 3 people talk, or and really making it a point to say, like Bernard Tyson did, like, it is your job to share your perspective. From wherever you sit, everyone's got a different perspective. Everyone sees the process from a different angle, so making it really embedding that into every time you share, every time you're making a big decision. Are we gathering enough? Are we doing enough research? We do this.
This is why I love vision boards. I love visual systems, because for those people who don't feel confident and comfortable speaking in a meeting because of their own personalities, the ability to go and add their feedback or their comments on a vision board, or back in the day they used to have the little what do they call them, the boxes that people put suggestion
box. Yeah.
I think
having all those things, right? Having all those mediums that folks can go, we have a suggestion box, why doesn't anybody use it? Well, because that's not always how people want to share, right? Yeah.
Correct. But I think you have these, as you think about the diversity of your organization, there's so many little opportunities where it doesn't have to be someone raising their hand in a meeting. Could be that.
Yeah, it could be
that. There's other spaces. And I think that the same is true as we were to talk about idea sharing and getting people's feedback, and how there is a suggestion box and no one's opening the suggestion box. there's no follow-up on what's happening with the
Right.
recommendations that have been made. And
Yeah.
so really, I think sort of creating the space for sharing the ideas, good, bad, or indifferent, right?
Right. Yeah. Just the fact that we got 50 ideas and this is what they look like.
Hey,
Celebrating
we want-
just
you know,
that.
yeah. So let's set some goals for idea sharing. We want to make sure we're getting every quarter, we get blah, blah, blah number of ideas that are
Mhm.
coming in. And oh, by the way, we're going to show those. We're going to show them at our team meetings, at our quarterly meetings, at our, president's meeting, whatever these are, these
Yeah.
sessions.
Yeah.
Information gets shared. And there's as much energy for this as there are for the, the balance sheet or,
Yeah.
or the,
Yeah. Yeah, like
so-
that in and of itself is the KPI, right? We want to get 50, 50 fresh ideas. We want to recognize the silliest idea. We want
Yeah.
whatever it is, like celebrating just the idea generation in and of itself. I've seen in meetings too where folks like appoint somebody each time, a rotator, and it's like, okay, this meeting you're going to play devil's advocate, right? It's your job to ask lots of questions. So then it makes it a little less personal, right? What's my job? It's one of the things that I loved about being a young project manager in a space that I knew nothing about, because I could just be like, hey, I don't, what are we doing? And at the time I didn't realize what a huge value add it was. I thought I was just a dumbass, right? But really it generated other thinking. It spurred other dialogue. I would raise a question that people were making assumptions about because they had all done this for 20, 30 years and just assumed that they were all on the same page and did it the same way or had, the same experience. And I'd be like, well, how are we going to actually write that thing? And I'd be like, well, we're going to do it that way. And then somebody else would go, no, that's not how we do it, or, whatever. And so you think that you're asking the dumb question, but really what you're doing is encouraging dialogue, so having that be somebody's job to do, and not making it the same person every time, because that gets wearisome, can be real value.
It's interesting because when I do consulting engagements, I set the stage. You're going to hear me ask why a lot. And this doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It means, one, I don't know it. And two, I'm probably asking why to help spur thought in your own mind, because a lot of times, I'll be honest, you go in and you look at like process improvement and it's like, why are you doing this thing over and over? And it's like, well, my manager told me to do that thing. So you go to the manager, why did we do it? Well, because the director told us to do it. And then it turns out it was like someone from 10 years ago put this process in place before we had technology and systems or whatever. And so it's like we really fall into the pattern of just doing the thing that we got trained to do without asking why. And if I could give anything, any advice, anywhere to anyone, it is create a culture of why. Don't feel offended when someone's asking why, but feel emboldened to talk about the why. Because if you can't talk about the why, then you have to ask why you're doing it, right? And that, how quickly we eliminate that money from that $62 million that's being wasted. Probably more than that if we start to talk about process. So I think if we create this space, if we can, I think we talked about, I'm going to go back through our list of 4. Okay. So we talked about building a growth mindset. And that really is about sort of all the stuff we've talked about, this idea of why, of creating a space that allows people to ask questions, that's constantly looking for ways of feedback. The idea that I don't have to have the best idea, but we are all sort of like manifest these ideas together to get to the better solution. How leaders are showing up with blame, like you just have to end the blame game. It doesn't work. We have to have diversity of thought. There should be, you and I talked about this and we won't go too deep because of time, but this idea of difficult conversations and really needing to just change that to, we're just having conversations because we're not always going to
just connecting. We're just learning from each other, learning where we're coming from, learning how we're feeling.
Yeah. And then I would say putting as much energy into this idea of diverse thought, people giving feedback, sharing information, making those goals, right? And giving space to allow that.
Celebrating
to
the
work
process just as much as the outcome.
out. You said my favorite thing. Fall in love with the process. Fall in love with the process. Fall in love with the process.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well,
this was so fun. This was great. It's always wonderful to chat with you. So next up, when we next get together, we're going to talk about the importance of everyone being aligned to the goals. So how this is not only supports engagement, but gives people purpose and helps remove the clutter, to stop the busyness, the frenetic.
Right. Yeah. The idea of the hustle. I'm like, we don't have to hustle. We all know where we're going. Makes the road so much easier to get there. And I think laying the foundations. I'm excited to have the goal setting discussion, because I think that once you create a safe environment, the goal setting is critical. So we're all just rowing the boat in the same direction. We all have sort of the same North Star. So I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah. Well, so fun, my friend. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
Bye, Rachel.
Let me loose and set me free.